Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast, Bone Bootcamp with Sarah Purcell. I'm your host, Sarah. This podcast, my newsletter, and all of my programs are designed to help women approach aging with confidence and courage. I'm specifically focused on bone growth promotion and skeleton-safe movements in Bone Bootcamp, the course, and Short and Sweet with Sarah, the membership. In this podcast, I strive to bring you all the most current information on living your best life as you age. Let's get on with today's episode. Thank you for joining me today for Bone Bootcamp, and I have a special guest, Nikki Naab-Levy. And Nikki has a practice that's near and dear to my heart because she started out as a Pilates instructor as well. And I shouldn't even say instructor, it's teacher. Teacher, because we share way beyond just Pilates instruction. And the reason I connected with Nikki was I too was a Pilates person who was seeking strength training. And that is one of the things that Nikki really excels at. And she speaks from a place that is very close to my heart, and that is women don't do enough strength training. They're not encouraged to do it. They're afraid of it. All kinds of hang-ups involved in that. But we're going to talk about all kinds of things. So I'm going to hand it over to Nikki and ask Nikki if she could tell the audience a little bit about herself.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Sarah. So I think the long short of this is that I've been in the Pilates/fitness industry for 16, almost 17 years now. I started in group fitness and Pilates. I didn't know it at the time, but I was hypermobile, which made me really prone to pain and injury because of the high impact, high intensity style of group fitness I was doing. I suffered a lot of injuries. I went down what I would call the Pilates post-rehab rabbit hole and spent a lot of time and money and energy learning stability techniques and all the things that were supposed to stop you from being injured or prevent injury or get you out of pain. I also went down the massage and the somatic rabbit hole, did a lot of education. And the irony in all of that was it helped until it didn't help. And the thing that really got me out of pain and got me into a place where I thrived, and then of course I taught this stuff to my clients and I started noticing my clients thrived, was strength training. And when I didn't start strength training to get out of pain. I really started it for other reasons, to be perfectly honest. And then it just helped with all my problems. And I was like, why did no one ever tell me about this? And I was like, oh, lots of people know this, just not in any of the spaces that I've been studying.
Right.
Right. It's not that my teachers were bad teachers. It's just that I think we get really stuck on the line of thinking of the people around us. And the reality is that lots of different things can have lots of different solutions. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly. And as you were talking, it just popped into my head something that Cecily Milne said recently about a yoga journal headline about the 5 stretches to do for your tight hips. And I'm sure you were rolling your eyes just as Cecily was and just as I was, that there's this little intersection between tightness and strength that isn't, I guess, not commonly known, because something as big as Yoga Journal is still trying to sell that you can stretch your way out of those tight feelings.
Yeah. And I think the challenge with that is that it's like when we go into once you know things, it's really hard to say anything in a soundbite because the human body is really complicated. But it's so stretching may make your tightness feel better, but it may not, because tightness can be manifested as a lot of different things and a result of a lot of different things. And for a lot of people in yoga, but also general public, usually it is that we need more strength. And so it's is stretching a potential solution? Maybe, but it's a really incomplete solution.
That's where I would go. Yeah, it's just incomplete. I have nothing against passive stretching. For my population with low bone density, I do have something against passive stretching where the assist puts torque, we really want to stick with our active range of motion when we're stretching, when we have low bone density, just so we don't edge into that area of torquing a bone. But yeah, it's the whole idea of incomplete. It's great to stretch, but what are you going to do with that? And that's where I think you come in big time.
Yeah.
And
I mean, exactly. And I think it's like when we start thinking about that, like it's great to stretch, but what are you going to do with that? It's like, I think we're often attracted to the things that feel familiar and safe, right? Or that we feel we're going to be good at. And I think for a lot of people, stretching feels safe, right? Especially when we start talking about women and strength training, and particularly older women and strength training. And I've worked with a lot of older clients. That's the vast majority of who my clients have been. Strength training seems really scary, right? I think that's actually why we end up in the yoga and the Pilates space as women. It's like, and especially as we get older, right? It's like, just go into the light. And I'm like, no, don't go into the light. The light is not where the answer is. But they're like, it's gentle, it's safe. And I think the issue with that is that actually the way that you can get hurt doing anything, don't get me wrong. But like the way I think that we get past this thing where it's like about safety is like, you have to challenge your body in an intelligent way to have resiliency. And when we look at this from a place of injury prevention, bone density, increasing muscle mass, or at least maintaining muscle mass, what that requires is doing more physical challenge or load than what you would do in daily life. And the reality is that yoga and Pilates don't really typically offer those loads. To do that, you're going to need to do more big, quote unquote, global exercises, or in strength training, we might call them lifts, right? Like a deadlift or a squat or an overhead press with progressive amounts of weights. And I think the thing that happens to us, especially in marketing, is we hear you need to lift heavy, and then we think of CrossFit, and then we see this person doing this terrifying thing as fast as they can who looks like they're going to tear your head off. And there's nothing wrong with CrossFit if that's for you and if you're well adapted for it. But for the average person, your strength training experience is not going to look like CrossFit. It's going to look like pick up a weight that feels heavy for you today, but manageable for you today.
Right.
Do something with it up and down for 8 times 2 or 3 rounds, and then move on to something else. It really isn't, it feels hard, but it's not like, it shouldn't be terrifying. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And one of the funny things is that, there are people who will poo-poo what they call pink weights, but darn it, you have to start somewhere. You don't just go into a gym from having low muscle tone to picking up a 10-pound weight and doing a bicep curl. You don't. So it's what you referred to earlier, and I talk about all the time. We want to understand the fundamental movement. We want to get that fundamental movement down. Then we want to slowly progress. And so whether it's your client who might have a lot of previous injuries or my client who might have low bone density, I think that's where you and I really are coming to the same place.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of those things where there's sort of 2 pieces in all of this. And this is for all humans. This isn't just if you've had an injury or if you have low bone density, right? Where it's like, figure out how to challenge and load your system with the exercises that you can effectively challenge and load your system, right? So whatever your version of a squat is, whatever your version of a deadlift, right? You can kind of get started with that sooner than you think you can usually.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you also have to work on these preparatory pieces and stability and mobility. And so that might be a little bit more local. That might be a little bit more unloaded. That might look like these really tiny ankle exercises or these really specific shoulder exercises. And it's not one versus the other. It's finding the right combination of both for you.
Right. And I'm sure you get the same. It's so fun that you brought up these tiny exercises, because I think you and I both sometimes get the kind of question where somebody says, could you give me the 3 exercises that will do blah, blah, blah for me? That's a toughie. Well, yeah, I can give you 3 exercises, but but have we talked about how you're going to prepare to and how you're going to be ready to do that? And how you're going to regress it and progress it.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges that comes up is, and I'm not going to say people fall more into one or the other, because again, it's like they end up falling to one side of the spectrum. So I think one side of the spectrum is people get stuck in what I fondly refer to as the pillow fort jail. So it's like, let's make sure your head is just so. Let's make sure your knee is just so. Oh, careful with your back, right? Like it's like this very kind of cautious, hypervigilant space, and pretty soon they're afraid to move, and they're like, I can never squat. And it's like, no, honey, you can sit down, stand up. You do that out of a chair. We'll figure out a way for you to squat sooner than later, right? Like for the most part, there's some basic things that we want you to be able to do quickly. Right. So they're just afraid to progress, and they get stuck, I think, also in the tiny pink dumbbell jail, where there's nothing wrong with the tiny pink dumbbell. But sometimes I'm like, you're stronger than that, right? Like much stronger than that. I can see it. And then on the flip side, there's people who, I think I'm one of those people. They get a little impatient, or like they go to someone who doesn't understand the nuance of this, like that person or that trainer is well-meaning. They just don't get it. And that person, and they do something that they're not well prepared for, and then they do hurt and they do feel bad. And then they go, oh, well, strength training hurts me. These exercises hurt me. And it's like, no, just the way that it was applied didn't make sense for where you're at.
Right. And there's also that little conundrum of so many of us are used to thinking, and particularly with our younger selves, that younger self in the back of our mind, that pre-perimenopausal self, where you could do 100 burpees and it didn't mess up your cortisol levels and it didn't freak out your system and make you crazy. And there's this whole concept of, well, I didn't sweat enough in your class, so it wasn't hard enough for me.
Yeah. And at that point, this is where I think this issue comes in, where I'm like, we need more scientific literacy as people. And I understand why people don't understand this, like, because it's not taught. It's certainly not part of fitness marketing, right? But it's like, there's science behind this in terms of like exercise is actually best thought about as dosage. And what's so interesting is even in elite athletes, I'm going to get parts of this study wrong, but the study exists, right? But there's all these studies that have been done that even in elite athletes, but they've done this, I think now with like menopausal women too. It's all very interesting where there's a threshold. This threshold is different for everyone, where you need a certain amount of stimulus or exercise to get all of these great effects of, let's say, strength training. You get to get bone density, to get these positive hormonal changes, all of these things. And then there's this point of like no return in stimulus, where it actually increases inflammation. And it actually, you get worse and you feel worse. And I think that's something that we have to start thinking about is, what is the dosage? Because it's going to be different for everyone. Like, I'm one of those people that even in my 20s doing 100 burpees messed me up. Like, I don't have a system that's built for that. I'm already high stress. I got a whole bunch of weird subclinical things that no doctor's ever going to bother finding the right diagnosis for, which is fine. I manage it, right? But like, I know that for me, that type of stimulus does not do good things to my body. So I think it's helpful to be empowered with that knowledge of more isn't better. And it's the same thing with sweating. They've done some studies that I think are really interesting, that the I don't know if ACE did the study. They're the American Council of Exercise, or if they were quoting it. It's older, right? But they looked at hot yoga and they were like, oh, when you do yoga poses in a cool room, your rate of perceived exertion, how much you sweat, how hard you felt it was, feels lower. And your work output is, let's just say 10 is the made up number, right? And they had people do the same thing in a hot room, and the people's rate of perceived exertion was, let's say, a 20 instead of a 10. They thought they worked way harder and they sweat way more, but their actual work output was the exact same. And I think that's worth knowing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it sure is. And an excellent reminder that as we live in older bodies, what shall I say, the optimal place to get that benefit generally involves more rest than you used to have. So as you just pointed out, Nikki, there's this perceived exertion, doesn't have to be a super sweaty experience. And then there's also this whole rest and recovery, which professional athletes, elite athletes totally understand. They completely understand. And I think sometimes the rest of us forget that.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, is that exercise, strength training is the stimulus, but where you see the changes and the positive benefits is in the rest and recovery. And if you just keep overloading and hammering your system, you're not going to get that.
Right. And I've experienced it myself with, and maybe you do too, with some of the work that I do, where I really have had to cut back on what is the weight that I'm holding when I'm teaching a class, because I did my own weightlifting yesterday and now I'm teaching a class, and I really started to experience some sort of unique cortisol reactions because I was really overstressing myself. I was continuing to to lift heavier weights every day of the week, and that wasn't working out.
I mean, that was the cause of most of my group fitness injuries and pain and inflammation and woes. And so, now I'm much smarter about that, where I teach very few live stream classes, and I actually make my third strength training workout a week. That's my workout.
Yeah.
I plan my workout around when I'm teaching my classes, or I only teach restorative stuff. And that's why I value saving my body as much as I value teaching other people, because otherwise I can't be here and do this stuff,
Right. Exactly. Yeah. A very good point. What do you find that your clients seek from you the most? The advice or the types of classes? Maybe both. What's the advice they seek, and what types of classes do they seek?
I mean, I think the most common question I get is something akin to, I have this insert pain injury here, right? I have sciatica. What should I do? I have, hip arthritis. What should I do? Right? I think those are sort of the things. And again, not to make fun of it, but a little bit, the tendency is to, again, want to go into the light, right? Maybe I need more restorative. And I mean, again, like if you're one of those people who's hammering your system and you're like at a 12 out of 10 all the time, you do need more restorative. But I find that by the time someone finds me, they've done a lot of restorative. They've done a lot of stability. They know more about body work than I do with all of my education. And they're not even a professional body worker. They've just done it all, right? And then the conversation often becomes like, well, have you tried strength training? And then the conversation becomes something where they go, yes, I bought this, I took this class that's very frenetic. They don't say that, but I go look it up, right? And they're like, and I did all of these lunges and my hip really hurt. So I just started using a lighter weight as I did more and more lunges. And then, or they're like, yeah, I know about pain science, but like, I have this sciatica thing. And so when I lift, I hurt. And then this is that education piece that I think is missing for people, where I go, okay, so you shouldn't be constantly flaring your stuff in your, I'm just going to air quote, your strength training or your kettlebell experience, right? So I think this goes back to, again, a lot of the time is you usually have to address those underlying pieces, but also find a way to practice the exercises with maybe a heavier weight, maybe not, but in a lower volume, where there's not lots and lots of something. It's a handful of a certain type of exercise done really well with enough weight that it challenges your system appropriately, done in a way that it doesn't flare up a pre-existing problem.
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. That is definitely the path we are on. And so what is the kind of class you get requested the most? Is it restorative, or do you get other classes requested a lot?
I mean, again, I think part of this is my background is as much as I espouse strength, people still, marketing, people still look at me as like the post rehab person. So I do get a lot of requests for things like foam rolling and stability. And again, I don't want to say this stuff doesn't have value. I think that tuning in, addressing your movement patterns, feeling and finding where you're at, like that's foundational and it's really important. So I get a lot of requests for that. But I also get a lot of requests for essentially like a low impact version of something that might feel more challenging, like a Tabata class or like a strength class. But it is more, I'm using air quotes, but like, joint friendly. It actually,
Right.
it feels challenging. Like they feel like they can do things and they feel empowered, but it's not done at like this like rapid fire frenetic pace that goes back to the 100 burpees, because most of us, maybe all of us, don't really need that.
No, we don't. So true. Well, I'm really enjoying everything we are talking about, and I think there's just one last thing that we sort of alluded to, and that is that strength training. I do get the question, and I bet you do too. Strength training is about starting with fundamental movement and then progressively loading. And I get the question from people, well, am I going to be progressively loading forever? And then I'm going to get so ripped and not look like a girl. Do you get that?
I do. I get that question a lot. And a lot of the time it doesn't come in the form of a question. It comes in the form of a survey response when I run one, right? Where it's like, they're like, well, I only do yoga and Pilates because I don't want to get bulky. I only want to be toned.
Right. Right.
and the reality is that like, again, I'm not mocking this. Body image issues are real. These concerns are real. Our society is not nice to women. Not nice to women. You know what I mean? So so these are real concerns because it actually could affect how someone treats you, which is why our culture, frankly, needs to change. But I think what's important for people to understand is if you're seeking aesthetic benefits, ironically enough, a lot of the time, the strength training combined with, usually for some people, it requires a caloric deficit. We're not going to have that whole conversation today, but usually some amount of strength training for women will actually make you look, quote unquote, more toned than yoga or Pilates will, because you have to have muscle on your bone to like have that aesthetic, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
Right. But also the odds of you getting bulky with the type of strength training that we're talking about are like, and bulky is also such a subjective term, right? What does that mean?
Right.
It's really unlikely and hard to do. You would have to be eating in a way that you probably are not eating, like force feeding yourself protein. Most women don't even get enough protein, possibly eating at least at maintenance, if not in a caloric surplus. A lot of women tend to, if anything, undereat sometimes. And you'd have to, and the amount of weight that you would have to be lifting and the amount of, and how often you would have to be lifting to create those changes are like, it'd be really, really difficult to do. And frankly, a lot of the people who you see who are women who look like that in that professional, let's say, bodybuilding community, a lot of them use steroids and supplements and other drugs and things that you're never going to use. So I think the fear of bulkiness I think it's legitimate because of the culture that we're in.
Correct.
But I think the odds of you actually having that experience of your aesthetic changing that way is pretty unlikely.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I would agree. I would totally agree. Well, is there anything we didn't cover in this whole strength training idea and world that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, I think the main takeaway I would like to encourage people with, or make them feel maybe a little bit better about, is that if you've tried these things and it didn't work, something went wrong in the process, right? You tried it, you didn't like it. You tried it, you hired the wrong person. You tried it, you flared up your, pre-existing injury. that's part of the learning curve, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
So just understand that part of learning is just trying things and stumbling around. I've stumbled around for years and years. I feel like I still stumble around. And also, I think in that stumbling, if we can stop looking at this as failure and start looking at this as a learning curve of learning, like, what makes sense for me, that's where you're going to find the best answers. Because as we kind of talked about with things like, what exercises do you need, how much rest and recovery do you need, how well did you sleep, like all these other things, that's actually how you figure it out, is you find the edges. If you're doing something with a lightweight for a while, you're like, this is really easy, I could do 20 of them. Okay, start to gradually increase that weight. And if you do something and for a few days you feel weird or sore or icky, go like, oh, maybe that was a little too much. And then you dial it back, but start looking at how your body responds as just information on what to do next, instead of like trying to get it right, because you're not going to know until you try. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. That's really excellent advice. It's all a learning. And it's not just with strength training, it's with all things about our body. What I thought was piriformis syndrome probably wasn't that at all. And now I don't even care what it was because I've just tried enough things to find a way to get a little bit of movement in a lot of places instead of allowing my one hypermobile spot to do all the work. And voila, things start getting better. So it was all experimentation.
Yeah. I think that's the thing, is there's no one person or thing that's going to have all the answers. Yeah. Any challenge you have, whether your challenge is bone density, an injury, my most long-standing recent one was sleep, it comes from trial and error, and you just sort of pick what works and you keep it with you, and you just leave the rest. And I just think that's a really good process for figuring out an approach that doesn't feel intimidating or scary. And also, I think empowers us in a world full of really bad, like a lot of misinformation and kind of crappy fear-mongering marketing, for us to go, I know I keep trying to go back to like that burpee class, but that really isn't working for me. And I think I finally have just accepted that that's not my fate, and I'm okay with that. And so when someone's like, want to go to that, or you see an Instagram post about it, you're like, you know what? Peace and love. I'm just going to pass. I'm good. The thing I have works.
I like your advice. Excellent advice. Well, thanks for joining me and having a conversation about all things strength. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to talk about this stuff. And yeah, if anyone wants to, nerd out on it more, some of the things I alluded to, I also have a podcast called Results Not Typical. So anyone who's curious about that.
That was going to be my next thing, is you have a fabulous Instagram account as well. And we'll put, I know all your stuff, but maybe if you send me a little email with the full list, so I make sure I get it all right. Your podcast is great. Results Not Typical is a really fun podcast with lots of good guests. And Instagram is full of stories, and you can swipe that screen so many times you're going to get tired with Nikki. She has so much to offer. So.
Yes, well, thank you. I think my Instagram is a little too honest, so and it's probably not for the faint of heart,
but it's worth a read. It's worth a look. So thank you again for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Bone Bootcamp podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're loving the podcast, please subscribe. Also, share with a friend. I would really appreciate it. And if you're inspired, a really helpful thing to do is leave a review on iTunes or Spotify. Thank you again for joining me. See you in the next episode.